In response to billions of dollars lost annually to cyber criminals and with increasing cyber threats to America's national security, the FBI in 2002 created the Cyber Division at FBI headquarters. An assistant director, one of the FBI's most senior positions, leads the division, the mission of which is to coordinate cohesive cyber strategy, prevent crippling cyber attacks, and take down perpetrators of cyber crime. The FBI leads the National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force, or NCIJTF. The NCIJTF was established in 2008, is comprised of over 30 agencies from law enforcement, the intelligence community, and the Department of Defense. The NCIJTF representatives are co-located and work jointly to combat cyber threats to the United States through a whole-of-government strategy. FBI Assistant Director Bryan Vorndran leads the FBI Cyber Division and brings to this position nearly 20 years of executive experience with the Bureau. First assigned as a special agent to the Washington field office, where he primarily investigated criminal enterprises trafficking cocaine and heroin. His Bureau career includes participation in the International Contract Corruption Task Force in Afghanistan, Supervisory Special Agent and later Unit Chief in the Counterterrorism Division at headquarters, to lead for the Washington Field Office's Joint Terrorism Task Force, to Assistant Special Agent in charge of Cyber and Counterintelligence at the Baltimore Field Office. Assistant Director Vorndran served as a Special Agent in charge, New Orleans Field Office just prior to his appointment as Assistant Director for Cyber in March 2021. To present an EDGE22 opening plenary keynote presentation, please welcome to the stage FBI Assistant Director, Cyber Division, Bryan Vorndran.
Shake your hand. So I get the pleasure of introducing Bryan. Bryan I've known a little bit growing up, but much more so in his current role. We were supposed to have today Dave Bowditch join us. Dave is now head of security for Disney, but he served as a deputy director. And I impressed upon him now in the private sector, having left the FBI, that in my view, the most critical role for private sector engagement with the FBI, from where I sit, for a large commercial enterprise, is the guy who occupies that assistant director job for the cyber division. And I said the selection of that role is absolutely critical to the FBI's success. And I was enormously gratified when someone of Bryan's reputation was placed into that role. And since he's been placed into that role, we have had collaborative engagement with his division at Dominion Energy, and I know that's true for a lot of other major commercial enterprises, but just an organic sort of new frontier style relationship. And I couldn't be more happy, and it's an absolute honor and pleasure to introduce Bryan Vorndran.
Good morning, everyone. These lights look a lot brighter from here than they did from the back, so I literally can't see anybody's faces. I was just joking with the congressman that the last time I had the opportunity to be in front of him was for 3 hours and 45 minutes of sworn oath testimony in front of House Judiciary, and so I enjoyed today a lot more than that day in May. My name is Bryan Vorndran. I appreciate the invitation to be here today. What I want to do is, the question I get all the time is, how does the FBI fit into this space? And so I'm going to do my best to answer that by describing our authorities, but by also giving you examples of the work that we're actually doing in real life to apply those authorities to my term, put pressure on the threat. And I'll be able to give you 3 good examples. I don't think that's near the totality of them, but those are the 3 I'll focus on today. 2 other notes. If there's any questions, I'm not sure how the time will be today. I do have a second session this afternoon. Just drop me a note card coming into, I believe, my 2:30 engagement, and I'll do my best to answer those questions during that time as well. And last question, or last thought on questions, is anything goes. If I don't know the answer, I'll be forward with you that I don't know the answer, and if I do, I'll do my best to share it with you. Last night on the Midway, I received 2 supplemental requests, one to talk about China and one to talk about partnerships. I pulled some notes on China, so I'll try to get to that. I'm going to actually flip through some slides here and get to the slide that I want as the backdrop. Okay, so the FBI's purpose, why do we exist in this ecosystem? We believe, and I think everybody else would believe, that we have very unique authorities or with other government partners, both domestic and foreign, or with private sector partners to impose cost on our adversaries. We are never going to indict our way out of the cybercrime problem. The reason for that is because of the safe haven status that exists for many of these criminals in the former Eastern Bloc. But the ultimate goal is to degrade the system between our authorities, our capabilities, and our partners' authorities and capabilities to essentially say to the criminals, this isn't worth your time. Again, because the traditional judiciary process is very difficult to apply. We will never lose sight of our judicial role, and we'll talk about that today. But the reality is bringing these people back to justice in this country is a very, very difficult proposition. During my testimony in front of House Judiciary, I used this line, and I'll use it again. You know, for those of you who are basketball fans, I had the fortune of attending the famous Duke, Kentucky game where Christian Laettner hit the shot in 1993. My dad was fortunate enough to get tickets. And so when we look at our role in the cyber ecosystem, we say sometimes we're Grant Hill throwing the pass, and sometimes we're Christian Laettner taking the shot. And in either scenario, we're equally comfortable because that is our role, and we're proud to serve in that role. So I'm going to go through authorities. It's going to get a little technical, but I think it's important, and that's why I'm going to spend some time on it. When everybody asks the FBI, what are your authorities within the cyber ecosystem? There turns out that there's about 8 different authorities that we have, and I'm going to step through those in just general terms, but by name. First, we have broad Title 18 and broad Title 21 authorities. Obviously, Rule 41, search and seizure, ties to that. The reason I specifically highlight that is because when I talk about Hafnium and what we call Operation Shell Sweep, when I talk about Cyclops Blink, the replacement for VPN filter for the GRU, Rule 41 became very, very important. Within Title 18, there's a section of code called 1030D2, which essentially says if there's a foreign adversary that conducts a cyber attack against a US-based entity, the FBI has primacy in terms of response. That's a very important statute for us that we pay attention to closely. We have broad counterintelligence authorities domestically here in the United States, obviously. Those counterintelligence authorities are different than our domestic intelligence authorities, which basically mandates that the Bureau, through Executive Order 12333 and Title 50, inform our partners, both private and public, about the intelligence picture here in the United States relative to their equities. We have FISA Title I authority. What's FISA Title I authority? That means we can intercept communications or conduct searches based on foreign state adversaries that are present in the United States. And then we have FISA 702 authority, which is parallel to other interagency partners, which basically allows us to look at foreign persons who are targeting the United States from outside of the United States. Those are our authorities. There's been a lot of talk within the community about, do there need to be authorities passed to different agencies than exist? My opinion on that is the answer is no. We actually have, when you look across NSA, Cyber Command, CIA, FBI, and now CISA, we have very, very complexly appropriate authorities. I think if there's a question to be driven is, do we have the resources within those agencies to drive the execution of all of those authorities? I think that's the better question for all of us. So when we sum our authorities, and everybody here knows, we have, you know, a very decentralized workforce. We have 56 field offices. We have cyber-trained personnel in every one of those 56 offices. We have representation in 70 countries around the world. We have 15 cyber-trained legal attachés in relevantly strategic positions throughout the world. But when you boil our authorities and the capabilities we have, what is our role? And I would say our role at the end of the day is to be a critical, indispensable teammate to all of you and to our public sector partners. I think we have 4 goals in that as a result of our authorities. Number 1 is to always try to take players off the field. And so I'm a huge football fan, and I don't love Tom Brady because he beats my team all the time, but I have a tremendous amount of respect for Tom Brady. And if I was a defensive coordinator against Tom Brady, my number 1 goal would be to keep him off the field, right? Well, somebody has to play the long game. We will always play that long game to take players off the field because that is the ultimate accountability other than financial seizures to have this problem reduce over time. We have tremendous domestic intelligence responsibility, and I think we do really well there. But as with everything, the evolution of the threat, the velocity of the threat requires us to put even more attention there so we're sharing more transparently in real time. I believe we have a role to put pressure on the threat. And when I say that, I mean both through defensive CNO and offensive CNO. I'm going to give you 2 examples today of defensive CNO and 1 example of offensive CNO. But we have to put pressure on the threat. And the last one, and people that work with me are tired of hearing me say this, but I think it's so relevant. Whether we are working with companies before an intrusion or during an intrusion, we owe all of you Ritz-Carlton level customer service, okay? One of the reasons everybody loves Starbucks is you can get your particular latte in New York and Seattle and they're all the same. It's really hard to drive customer service across 56 field offices in a way that is consistent every day, every week, every month. But that is our goal. Ritz-Carlton level customer service in the moments of pre-intrusion information intelligence sharing and Ritz-Carlton level customer service during an intrusion. We should be helpful. We should not be harmful. One of the questions I get asked all the time is, what does the FBI need in a moment of an intrusion? And so I'm going to do my best to answer that, primarily because there's a lot of urban legend out there about what we actually do or don't need, or the perceptions of how we will or won't arrive. And I'm going to hit pause here in my own remarks and say this. People refer to the FBI as law enforcement. I understand that. That is our history. It's at this point, 115 years of federal law enforcement. But within cyber, I would ask you to either expand or modify that industry to include law enforcement plus intelligence plus computer network operators, because we do those 3 things within the cyber ecosystem. We do not show up with raid vests on where there's a computer intrusion. That is not our role. On the screen in front of you are the things we actually need during a moment of an intrusion. And I think when everybody reads this, probably the most relevant response is, that's it? And so let's step through them. We need to know the date the incident began and when it was first observed. The reason for that is because our extraterritorial search authorities are most effective in the first 24 hours of a data exfil. We need to know general information about what was impacted. The IT system versus the OT system is the terms that I think are most relevant to this audience. That question for us is actually not necessarily relevant from a FBI operational perspective, but I think you all know that the briefing cycle that we all sit into the Deputy Attorney General and then the National Security Council is very relevant to those types of questions, and having consistent answers to those types of questions within the victims ecosystem and within the US government is very helpful. The intrusion set or malware, the ransomware variant is number 3. Why? Because we investigate and have operational capacity against almost every branded malware variant out there, and we want to quickly be able to provide a company in Little Rock, Arkansas, direct access to our Hive investigative team in Tampa. That's why we asked that question. Number 4 is the big one. Tactical intelligence, logs, IPs, and wallet information. That is the big one that I think you should take away from today. That preparatory steps today for in that moment would be very helpful. Number 5 was anything exfiltrated. I talked about why. The last question I get is, what about evidence? Do you need evidence? Sure we do, but we don't need it in that moment. Communication and dialogue about reasonable goals matters during pre-intrusion relationship building and during an intrusion. And the bottom line is that evidence of those logs and where we see the initial vector of the attack and the attacking IP, right? That is information that will help us, but is not needed in that moment. But the importance of this conversation is the opening dialogue. I want to take a minute to touch on regulators and OFAC, and then I want to talk about themes of the FBI's customer service during a moment of intrusion. One of the questions we get all the time is, does the FBI share transparently with regulators? The answer to that question is we do not. We are not responsive to regulator requests for intelligence or information based on our relationship with any company during the pre-intrusion stage or during the intrusion stage. One of the newest spins is companies receiving requests from regulators that read like this: hey, we want what you gave to the FBI. Our response, or recommended response to that question, is pretty simple. The FBI came to us with a narrow set of needs to support their operational needs. We have been responsive to that. We know we have a regulatory responsibility to you. Let's talk about specifically what you need and we'll be responsive to that, but let's not let these two roads cross. We don't want to be in the middle of those conversations. I think you can understand why. OFAC. Treasury has issued guidance, and it's about 6 points of guidance, but it essentially says one of the most significantly mitigating steps any company can take is to engage federal law enforcement before potentially paying a sanctioned entity. We are happy to fill that role. What that looks like in real time is, hey, here are the monikers, the virtual wallet information we have as a result of a computer intrusion where we were a victim. We would take that and run that across entire IC holdings and say, hey, here's what you do or don't have at risk in terms of payment. Okay, themes of our engagement with you during intrusion. As I said, Ritz-Carlton level customer service, super important. So number one chance to make a first impression. Number two, empathy and patience with a victim is paramount and number one in terms of priority. Number three, setting expectations. What can we do and what can we not do? We cannot hack back. Well, we actually can, but we will not hack back, okay? And setting those expectations early is helpful. Here's something we can do. We've had companies say to us, hey, I can't take any more calls from national level media. Can you direct all of those to your national press office? Yep, no problem. That's just one example. Number four, to encourage the victim to provide information quickly and explain why time matters. And number five, share as you go information exchange bilaterally with a long haul view, okay? The reason I highlight those is that is what we are pushing out to our field office for engagement. Why do I think that matters? Because in there is nothing about what we need from you technically at the moment of an intrusion. The spirit of it is treating all of you as a victim no differently than we would treat any other victim of a crime in those moments. Okay, I want to talk now about the application of the FBI's authorities, because I think if I were you, the primary question I would want to know is, what are you actually trying to do to help, right? And so I'm going to give you 3 examples and walk you through them in pretty good detail. The first 2 examples I'm going to walk you through in detail because we have received a lot of questions from the Hill and from the media about have we overstepped the legal rights of Americans? And I'll walk you through that legal analysis and explain why we did what we did. We're going to talk about hafnium, what we call Operation Shell Sweep. And I'm going to walk you through this timeline. I know it's probably a little bit small to read, but I will walk you through it in detail. By the way, these 2 slides that are about to come up are still classified FOUO, so I just ask that no photographs be taken of them. When I brief this to you or talk through this with you, I want to keep 2 key things in mind. Number 1 is we're moving from least intrusive to most intrusive techniques to mitigate the threat. And number 2, when we've exhausted our least intrusive means, does the bad guy get a vote about the remaining attack vector and whether it's big enough to do damage? Our answer to that is always going to be no. Okay, so let's walk through this. December of 2020, DevCore discovers 2 bugs and develops a workable RCE exploit. In January of 21, Microsoft releases emergency patching, acknowledges the existence of the vulnerability, and published the Hafnium blog. In March of 2021, FBI confirms the presence of more than 15,000 PowerShells on US computers and/or servers. March 3rd of 2021, Microsoft releases the CVEs and credits DevCore. March 10th of 2021, FBI and CISA publish a joint cybersecurity advisory. I'm now walking you through the least intrusive means. Microsoft publication as they should, FBI and CISA publishing a joint CSA to say to the public, this vulnerability exists, you need to patch. Between March 11th of 2021 and March 31st of 2021, the FBI conducted thousands of victim notifications. Between the Microsoft advisory, the Joint Cybersecurity Advisory, and the victim notifications, we reduced those 15,000 PowerShells by 94%, okay? But that remains the question. There's still a 6% attack surface available to the adversary. And should the adversary, in this case the Chinese government, have decision space to leverage that 6% remaining of that attack surface? Our answer to that is always going to be no, if we have the legal authority and the capabilities to do it. So I'm gonna read something to you because I think it's important. We leverage Rule 41 to essentially mitigate the rest of these PowerShells. In terms of leverage authorities, the Fourth Amendment regulates searches and seizures and often, but not always, requires a warrant. It was fairly clear to the FBI and the Department of Justice that copying a web shell from a victim computer was a search. But the law was less clear about whether the Fourth Amendment regulated the step of deleting the web shell, the presence of which had the potential to cause future injury to victims. Nevertheless, we are permitted and indeed encouraged to always seek warrants in circumstances where, strictly speaking, a warrant may not be required. And Rule 41 of the search and seizure laws designates instrumentalities of a crime as righteous evidence to be seized. So we determined that the application of Rule 41 through the warrant process would allow us to copy and delete the web shell as part of this operation. The operation was purposely surgical. It did not expose the contents of the victim computers to the FBI, and it only interacted minimally with the exact file path where that web shell was hosted. We ran a delete command after copying it. Why did we copy it? For evidentiary purposes. And essentially, we're able to move that attack vector to 0%. So here's the summary. Between 2 Microsoft disclosures, a joint cybersecurity advisory, thousands of victim notifications, least intrusive, we moved the attack vector by a reduction of 94%. At that point of the game, the question we always get is, why did you not do more victim notifications? Because time matters, and the simultaneous removal of the remaining attack vector is a priority. And let me say this, when we knock on a victim's door, and we say, an unwitting victim, and say, hey, knock, knock, it's the FBI. We believe you have malware from the Chinese on this server. Here's how that conversation doesn't go. Hey, come on in, show us exactly what computer you're talking about. Let us open our doors to you. Here's how the conversation goes. Stuart Baker's in the audience. He's a very good friend of ours. I hope he would say the same about us, and a very good attorney. Here's how the conversation goes. Let me call my attorney and we'll be in touch, right? My point is this, when you start to force multiply that across hundreds or thousands of victims, the simultaneous action becomes really important and almost impossible to do individual victim notifications. As I said, the court authorization was surgical. It did not touch or review or see any other part of the computer besides that file path. Next, let's talk about Cyclops Blink. Cyclops Blink is the replacement for VPN filter from the GRU. Again, a similar timeline on here. We call this operation Operation Johnny Cash. Okay, the first one was Operation Shell Sweep. This is Johnny Cash. Similar data here. Command and control nodes globally, both in the United States and outside the United States, 5,000 end user devices. I'll just hit a couple quick dates here. November 30th, 2021, FBI notifies WatchGuard, who is an awesome partner through this process, of the fact that there was a vulnerability in their edge firewall and that it was being exploited by the Russians. WatchGuard worked very collaboratively with the Bureau and with other IC components to develop the right patch for that, but it took them a long time because of some of the complexities. Nothing to do with WatchGuard's investment in the process, all to do with the complexity of the vulnerability. February 23rd, 2022, WatchGuard has the patch and the remediation steps available. The UK, FBI, NSA, and CISA deploy a cybersecurity advisory with the remediation guidance. February 24th, Russia invades Ukraine. Between February 25th and early March of 2022, the FBI conducts hundreds of victim notifications, similar story to what I just told you. But there's one critical difference, and that's that we knew from our collection that the GRU was still operating and maintaining and trying to grow the botnet post-intrusion of Ukraine. And again, the question is, even though we have reduced the footprint of the attack vector both in the United States and outside the United States, are we going to let an adversary, in this case Russia, in this case post-invasion of Ukraine, have access to a malicious set of computers that they can leverage for their capabilities? And the answer is obviously no. So let me give you some results. As a result of the Quad SEAL cybersecurity advisory, global C2s were reduced by 54% and US-based C2s were reduced by 33%. When you add in the victim notifications the FBI did, global C2s were reduced by another 27% and US-based C2s were reduced by another 51%. But it's still left an attack surface of 15 to 20%. Again, the same question applies. Are we going to put decision opportunities in the hands of an adversary when we have the authorities, the legal justification, and the capabilities to remove that malware and break the communication back to GRU? The obvious answer is no. We're really proud of these two examples. There's others, because people, I think, don't believe that the FBI has the technical capacity to do defensive CNO. There's heavy coding, heavy tool development in each one of these examples, and I, for one, am proud of the people that I know that were integral to this, that removed attack vectors for both the Chinese and the Russians. Last one is TODAYS. Everybody probably remembers TODAYS from fall of 2021, most prolific ransomware group out there. And so this is a little bit of a muted point of the presentation from me to you because much of this is still classified. So what I would say is that the FBI was in possession of very, very robust intelligence, and we were able to work very, very closely with US Cyber Command. And in the process, you can read some of these. This just gives me a little bit of glee to know what is actually behind this. And it says there's an absolutely bonkers flame war going on in the dark web right now. It's nuts, but American companies and government agencies might want to pay attention because the Russians are seeking revenge. It all started earlier this week when the US government reportedly launched a coordinated attempt to bring down the servers of the ransomware group REvil, which is TODAYS. And then it talks about Conti's reply to that. But we talk about joint and sequenced operations across the US government interagency and putting pressure on the threat. This is a perfect example of FBI and US Cyber Command working together to leverage our collective unique authorities to put pressure on the threat. What happened at the end of this? TODAYS essentially completely abandoned their infrastructure and went to ground for about 6 months. That is what we mean by imposing cost on the adversary. The last thing is this, and then I'll close. The question I always get is, what are your future concerns in the future for the cyber ecosystem? I have 4. Number 1 is increased precision of targeting. Right now, there is still enough low-hanging fruit to allow the adversary to hit targets of opportunity. But what happens when we become better from a net defense and resiliency perspective across the country, and adversaries start to specifically target cross-cutting software applications that, for example, could shut down our commercial real estate closing industry? What happens then? My advice to all of you, all the people I speak to, is think about the cross-cutting applications and software solutions that are used by your entire industry. They are probably target number one. Number two is what I refer to as the entrepreneurial spirit. I know I'm over time, but Mick from DOJ told me I could steal some of his time. So I'll just be another 2 or 3 minutes. The entrepreneurial spirit of the adversary. Right now, ransomware as a service is primarily branded in Eastern European languages, Cyrillic and English, right? What happens when that expands to Spanish and Chinese and other language where there are prolific hacker capabilities embedded in those countries? The threat, in my opinion, is nowhere close to plateauing because the opportunities for these ransomware as a service platforms have actually not been shared or offered to people who speak a different language. Number three is the blended threat. It is very difficult to tell where nation-state activity starts and stops and where criminal activity starts and stops. We know there are people moonlighting in both directions, okay? And the lack of understanding of command and control in that environment makes our jobs much more complicated. And the last one is artificial intelligence and synthetic content. There's a great book out there called Human Compatible that talks about the spread of AI and what it could mean to humankind. I think it's a consideration for all of us. We throw around these terms AI very, very loosely. I've recently started to read Google's blog on AI. They have actually a daily posting, and it's super complicated, but it's very difficult to articulate a position of how we actually control the spread of that. And I think that is something we are going to be undoubtedly talking about for the next decade. So I'll leave you with this. The FBI has been helpful, I hope, to all of you. If we're not, we would want to know about it. We are not perfect, and I will be the first one to admit to you that we are not perfect. But I know the talent that exists in the FBI personally, and I know what exists in those people's hearts as well. And that's when people ask me about the FBI and cyber, despite the fact that we're 20 years old already, I simply say the best is yet to come. And I really, really believe that, and I'm very proud to stand here before all of you today and represent the people of the FBI and the work they do, because that is what I'm doing, simply representing their work. Thank you. I'll see everybody later today.